Nancy Price was the kind of woman the corporate world relied on, but never noticed. Overworked, underestimated, and buried beneath the weight of other people's success, she had mastered the art of survival in silence. Quitting wasn't an option. Neither was being seen. But when a company Raffle pairs her with Elijah Cross, young, brilliant, and famously untouchable, over a single dinner, everything changes. He expected a social formality. She expected nothing at all. What neither of them expected was truth. The office was alive with the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional ping of incoming emails. It was the kind of place where the carpet muted footsteps and conversations rarely strayed from project deadlines or Q4 performance. Innovate Solutions, a rising tech behemoth in downtown Seattle, prided itself on efficiency, innovation, and its sleek, glass-heavy headquarters that glimmered like a jewel among a skyline of ambition. And somewhere on the 12th floor, at the far end of an open-plan workspace cluttered with standing desks and ergonomic chairs, sat Nancy Price. Her cubicle was modest, more practical than personal. A small cactus sat beside her dual monitors, and pinned on the gray divider wall was a single postcard of the Andromeda Galaxy. A silent rebellion in an office where inspiration was supposed to come from sales targets and strategic alignment meetings. Nancy was typing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. Spreadsheets, code snippets, pivot tables. It was all second nature by now. She had spent the last 3 years at Innovate Solutions, climbing from intern to junior data analyst, but the title felt ceremonial. No one really noticed her unless something was broken or overdue. Across from her, 2 colleagues laughed over a YouTube video muted with subtitles. A third, Devin, strutted past with a smoothie in one hand and a Bluetooth headset in the other, already mid-brag about his incomplete UX mock-up. None of them offered her a glance. None of them knew she'd just completed the revised KPI projections that Madison, her supervisor, had forgotten to prepare for the senior leadership team. "Nancy," came a voice from behind. She turned, already knowing. Madison looked flustered, wearing her usual power suit and a fake smile that never reached her eyes. "I need you to handle the Royston file. It's time sensitive, and I'm heading into back-to-back meetings all day." Nancy hesitated. She had already taken on 3 separate ad hoc requests from Madison this week. The Royston file was a mess, weeks behind and notoriously riddled with inconsistent data. "I thought that was assigned to Alex," Nancy said gently, pointing to the assignment board. Madison waved her hand dismissively. "Alex has too much on his plate, and you're great with detail. You'll figure it out." With that, she was gone, heels clicking like punctuation marks on the polished tile. Nancy stared at the screen, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. A breath hitched in her throat, anger, weariness, the feeling of being buried under invisible stones. She glanced around. The office was alive with collaboration, people chatting in clusters, managers giving nods of approval. No one saw her. No one cared to. And yet, if she left tomorrow, half of this floor would collapse under the weight of its own unacknowledged dependencies. It wasn't just the workload. It was the silence, the absence of thanks, the promotions that always passed her by in favor of louder, flashier names, the way people took credit for her data when it fit the narrative and blamed her when it didn't. By 6:47 p.m., the lights were dimming, and the office was nearly empty. Nancy was still at her desk, typing up a clean report for a manager who wouldn't read it. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since noon. When she finally shut her laptop and stood, her legs ached. She packed her bag slowly, gaze drifting toward the window where the skyline bled into purple dusk. Back in her apartment, modest, quiet, and filled with books and solitude, Nancy kicked off her shoes and sat by the window. She turned on the telescope, adjusted its settings, and aimed it at the early evening stars. The telescope had been a gift to herself after surviving her first year at Innovate. A reminder that there was a vastness out there beyond quarterly goals and endless pivot tables. She reached for a worn copy of Letters from a Stoic and read a passage underlined so many times the paper was starting to wear. Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body. Seneca. She read the line again, this time out loud, as though saying it could give the words weight, purpose, maybe even comfort. And yet, that night, as the stars glimmered faintly in the sky, Nancy felt no stronger, only tired. Like a constellation waiting for someone to trace her shape and finally see the design hidden in the silence. She placed the book down, stared at the ceiling, and whispered, "Something has to change." It was raining. Not the romantic, movie scene kind of rain, but the cold, unrelenting drizzle that soaked Seattle streets in a muted grayness. Nancy's umbrella had flipped twice in the wind before she gave up and walked the last 2 blocks to the office with her coat clutched tight around her. Inside Innovate Solutions, the air was dry and sterile, the warmth artificial, the greetings few. The fluorescent buzz overhead was already drilling into her skull, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. She passed by the break room where Madison stood with a few senior associates, laughing a little too loudly. Nancy nodded, but they didn't notice her. She wasn't part of that orbit. Her desk welcomed her like a silent partner in a lopsided marriage. An overflowing inbox blinked in her peripheral vision. 5 flagged emails from Madison. 3 from HR. 1 from the product development team asking for analytics on a campaign she had never even been briefed on. She hadn't even taken off her coat. Her fingers moved almost on muscle memory, responding to the most urgent requests, organizing files, preparing yet another pivot chart for someone else's presentation. Somewhere in the background, a familiar dull ache had begun to pulse at the base of her skull. An hour later, the cherry on top arrived. Madison swung by with that signature smile, painted on and unervingly polite. "Nancy, I hope I can count on you to finalize the Q2 feedback charts before end of day. I've got a thing with legal this afternoon. Oh, and could you take a look at my personal calendar? My assistant's out and it's a mess." Nancy blinked. "You want me to manage your personal schedule now?" Madison tilted her head. "I mean, you're so good with details. I'd do it myself, but you know how the day gets away from you." She trailed off and walked away mid-sentence. Nancy stared at her screen, unmoving. It was like being nibbled to death by ducks, tiny bites every hour, every day. Tasks that weren't hers. Recognition that never came. And always this assumption that she could absorb just one more thing. At lunch, she didn't go to the break room. Instead, she slipped into a conference room no one used and sat in the corner with a granola bar, chewing mechanically. The window beside her looked out over Elliott Bay, the water dark and cold, the sky a smear of cloud. Ships moved slowly in the distance like silent guardians of a life she wasn't living. She opened her laptop. No emails. No spreadsheets. No dashboards. Just a new document. She titled it plainly, Resignation Letter. Her heart pounded. She stared at the blinking cursor as if it were daring her to cross a threshold. This wasn't the first time she'd considered it. She had fantasized about this moment more times than she could count, about walking out with her dignity intact, about finally choosing herself over everyone else's demands. Her fingers began to type. "Dear Madison, after careful consideration, I have decided to resign from my position at Innovate Solutions effective 2 weeks from today." She paused. Her jaw clenched. Her mind raced through her budget, her obligations. Rent, $1,420. Groceries. Insurance. Her mother's prescription meds. Student loans. Credit card balance. Her stomach turned. What would she do? There was no safety net. No second income. No family money. Just her and her monthly survival strategy. Quitting might give her pride, but pride didn't pay electric bills or fix her mother's cracked dentures. Her fingers hovered. And then, with a quiet, angry breath, she selected the entire letter and hit delete. The blank screen returned, cleaner now but heavier somehow. She leaned back in the chair, arms folded across her chest, eyes closed. Outside, a seagull shrieked against the wind, echoing faintly through the sealed window. A buzz on her phone broke the silence. A new notification. Company-wide. Enter to win dinner with CEO Elijah Cross. One staff member will be selected at random. Deadline, Friday at noon. Nancy stared at it. She almost laughed. One of those morale campaigns they cooked up in HR. Some young intern probably thought it would make the CEO seem approachable. As if a 3-course meal with the company's golden boy could wipe out the burnout dragging so many of them down. Still, she clicked the link. The form was simple. Name. Department. Years of service. No essays. No recommendations. No politics. Just luck. She hesitated for a long moment, then typed her name and hit submit. She didn't do it because she wanted dinner, or FaceTime, or even recognition. She did it because, at that moment, she felt invisible, and entering her name into that raffle felt like whispering to the universe. I still exist. Thursday morning began like most others, gritty and gray, with the sun doing its best to penetrate the blanket of Seattle clouds. Nancy stepped into the office, umbrella dripping, boots squeaking faintly against the polished tile floor. Her coat was damp, her hands cold, and her heart already bracing for the pile of invisible tasks that would no doubt be waiting for her at her desk. But something was off. People were staring. Not overtly, but in the strange, sidelong way people look at someone who's been unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it wasn't kind either. A ripple of low whispers followed her down the corridor. She furrowed her brow, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, heart beginning to thump unevenly. Then she saw it. There, on her desk, gleaming like something out of a television sweepstakes commercial, was a gold envelope. Thick, embossed, her name elegantly written in looping calligraphy. Nancy looked around. Madison's office door was closed. Devin, at the next pod, smirked at her and nudged someone beside him. Cautiously, she picked up the envelope and slid it open with her thumbnail. A glossy card slid out. Congratulations, Nancy Price. You have been selected as the winner of our dinner with the CEO company raffle. You will dine privately with Mr. Elijah Cross on Thursday evening at 7:30 p.m. Location, top floor, Azure 47, downtown Seattle. Attire, business casual. She stared at the card for a long moment, half expecting Ashton Kutcher to jump out and shout that she'd been punked. But no, this was real. She slumped into her chair, the card still in her hand, the weight of it oddly heavy. Her email pinged 3 times in a row. She ignored them. Her heart fluttered with something between anxiety and dread. Elijah Cross, the elusive golden boy. CEO by 32. Harvard. Venture capital prodigy. Intimidatingly brilliant and, if the rumors were true, disarmingly handsome. She had only ever seen him in passing. Once during an all-hands Zoom call where his face was framed by natural light and expensive taste. He'd spoken confidently, efficiently, a man both aware of his power and seemingly detached from it. Why would someone like him care about having dinner with a low-level analyst? The answer was simple. He probably didn't. This dinner wasn't about connection. It was about optics, humanizing the corporate hierarchy, faking proximity to the common employee. She was just a pawn in someone's PR campaign. Still, the buzz in the office intensified. Lucky girl, someone muttered as they passed her desk. Bet you wore your lucky socks, joked another. Devin leaned in with a sly grin. Careful, Nancy. Don't fall in love over dessert. She forced a smile, tucked the invitation away, and opened her inbox. Work didn't stop for golden envelopes. But all day a low, persistent hum followed her, a tension in her chest that wouldn't quite settle. That evening, she stood in front of her closet with a kind of existential despair. She wasn't a dinner with the CEO kind of woman. Her wardrobe was practical. Pressed blouses, neutral sweaters, slacks that fit well but said nothing at all. Eventually, she settled on a navy wrap dress that had been purchased for a friend's wedding and only worn once. It hugged her figure modestly, the fabric soft but not flashy. She tied her hair up, then let it back down. Tied it again. She didn't know which version of herself she was supposed to bring. The Uber driver said nothing as they weaved through downtown traffic. Her stomach twisted as the elevator carried her to the 47th floor of Azure, a rooftop restaurant so exclusive she didn't even know it existed. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and she stepped into a space carved from glass and sky. The city glittered around her in every direction, skyscrapers piercing the clouds, reflections shimmering like stars caught in glass. And there he was. Elijah Cross stood by a curved window, gazing out over the city with a tumbler of something dark in his hand. When he turned, she almost forgot how to breathe. He wasn't just handsome. He was composed, tailored, alert without being intense. His eyes, not the cliché kind, but sharper somehow, landed on her, and something in his face softened. "Nancy Price," he said, stepping forward with a smile that was more human than she'd expected. "I'm glad you came." She blinked, unsure of what she expected. Stiff formality? A PA greeting her? A clipboard with talking points? But no, it was just him. And her. I wasn't going to pass up a free meal," she replied, the words escaping before she could check them. He laughed. Not politely. Genuinely. Good. Honesty. That's refreshing. They sat. The table was small, the lighting warm. No press. No HR handlers. Just 2 menus and a breathtaking view. The waiter arrived silently, and Elijah ordered with ease, asking Nancy if she had preferences. She chose what he chose, more out of nerves than anything else. As they waited for the first course, he asked, "So what do you do in the company again?" She gave a brief rundown. Junior data analyst. Internal optimization metrics. Nothing glamorous. "But you're the one who flagged the resource misallocation in the logistics pipeline, right?" he said. She blinked. "Yes, how do you know that?" He smiled faintly. "I read more of the reports than you'd think. Yours was the only one that didn't just complain about the problem. It proposed a solution." Nancy's chest tightened. Recognition felt strange. Alien. They talked more about work, yes, but it shifted. She mentioned her telescope. He admitted he once wanted to be an astrophysicist until business school got in the way. "Space makes everything feel small," she said, staring out the window. "It also makes everything possible," he replied, swirling his drink. By dessert, something had changed. Not dramatically, not romantically, but perceptibly. The dynamic was no longer CEO and employee. It was 2 people who didn't quite belong in the roles they'd been cast. When the evening ended, Elijah stood, hesitating. "I don't want this to be the last time we talk," he said. Nancy swallowed. "Is that a request or an order?" He smiled, slow and sincere. "A hope." Then he walked her to the elevator himself, hand in his pocket, expression unreadable. As the doors closed, she saw him standing there, alone in a room made of glass and power. And for the first time in years, Nancy felt seen. The morning after dinner with Elijah Cross, Nancy woke to the rarest of Seattle things, a sunbeam cutting across her bedroom floor. It startled her, as if the universe itself were gently shaking her by the shoulders, whispering, "Something is different now." But as she stood in the mirror brushing her hair, still faintly scented with the perfume she'd worn the night before, Nancy reminded herself not to be ridiculous. A dinner with the CEO didn't change her rent. It didn't change her workload. It certainly didn't change the deeply rooted, quietly tolerated culture that had kept her invisible for years. Still, she felt different. Like a curtain had been lifted, and now she could see something, herself maybe, with sharper lines. At the office, the stares were more intense this time. No longer curious, now edged with suspicion. "Did you get the lobster or the private jet?" Devin muttered as she passed his desk, loud enough for others to hear, but quiet enough to keep HR at bay. Nancy said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence only fed the rumor mill more. Madison called her into her glass office mid-morning, and the tone was sugar-coated venom. "So," Madison said, folding her manicured hands together, "I hear you and Elijah had quite the evening." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "It was a company raffle." Of course. Of course." Madison smiled, her voice saccharine. "Still, just be mindful. You know how things look." It was a warning disguised as concern. The same kind of coded, passive-aggressive note that kept women in their place in corporate hallways. Nancy left the office with her jaw clenched so tightly she had to force it open halfway down the hall just to breathe. She returned to her desk and buried herself in reports, trying to shake off the mixture of embarrassment and fury blooming inside her chest. Later that day, an email arrived. Subject: Internal Innovation Committee, invitation to join. Hi Nancy. Following our conversation at dinner, I'd like to formally invite you to participate in a new internal initiative focused on workplace culture and innovation. The committee will meet twice monthly, and your insights from the floor would be valuable. Elijah Cross. She read it 3 times. It was short, professional, and to the point. But underneath it, she heard his voice. Calm. Intentional. He hadn't forgotten their conversation about feeling invisible, about systems designed to elevate noise over substance. And apparently, he meant what he said. She hovered over the accept button for a full minute. She could hear Madison's voice in her head, be mindful. You know how things look. But something hardened in her chest. She clicked accept. The committee meetings were held in one of the company's lesser-known creative lounges, a space tucked away behind the 11th floor. It was all exposed brick, reclaimed wood tables, soft lighting, and the occasional bean-bag chair that no one dared actually use. There were 6 people in the first meeting, Elijah included. He arrived on time, no entourage, no laptop. Just a notebook and a black pen. He sat beside her, but not next to her. Respectful distance. Professional decorum. Still, she could feel his presence like gravity. The others were a mixed bag. HR, one designer from UI/UX, a senior accountant, and an operations lead. All with very different ideas on what culture meant. The meeting began awkwardly. Buzzwords were tossed around like confetti. Transparency, inclusion, flexibility. Nancy sat quiet for most of it, until someone suggested an interdepartmental trivia night as a way to boost morale. Trivia nights are fun, she said, finally speaking, but they won't fix a culture where overworked employees are too afraid to ask for help, or where mid-level managers bury problems to protect their own reputations. The room went still. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Elijah, however, looked at her directly and nodded. Go on. She took a breath. I've seen amazing talent burn out in silence. It's not about perks. It's about trust and responsibility. After the meeting, she collected her things slowly. Elijah approached her as the others filed out. I meant what I said at dinner, he said. You think like a strategist, not just an analyst. Nancy gave a half smile. Well, strategy doesn't exactly show up in my job title. Titles are cheap, he said. Impact isn't. She tilted her head slightly. And are you going to change the whole company culture based on a few committee meetings? His gaze was steady. I'm going to start by listening to the people who've been ignored the longest. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Just watched as he nodded once and walked away, leaving her standing in a pool of warm afternoon light. That night, back at her apartment, she didn't turn on the TV or her laptop. She brewed tea and sat by her telescope, pulling the lens into focus on the faint glow of Saturn. The rings shimmered just barely. She thought about Elijah, about the meeting, about the look he gave her, not admiration, not flirtation, but something rare in the workplace, respect. Maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to shift. She took a sip of tea and smiled quietly to herself. The stars hadn't moved, but she had. The second committee meeting took place a week later, but the space between the two felt far longer. For Nancy, the days dragged and rushed simultaneously, a strange paradox of waiting for something undefined, while also trying not to look like she was waiting at all. The Culture Committee had quickly become the unofficial talk of the office. Not because people cared about culture, most didn't, but because Elijah Cross cared. And anything he cared about, people watched. And when Nancy began showing up to those meetings, people started watching her too. Not with admiration, with suspicion. At first, it was subtle, offhand comments, a few knowing glances. Then came the snide remarks. "You're on a first-name basis now, huh?" said Derek from finance, leaning over the coffee machine one morning. "Make sure you tell Elijah we need better snacks in the break room," said another, sarcastically. She tried to ignore it. She focused on her work. She delivered Madison's reports early, triple-checked for errors. She said thank you even when no one deserved it. But still, the air around her grew colder. Madison, in particular, had changed her tone. The usual sugar had soured. Nancy's inbox began to overflow, not with requests but with assignments. Impossible ones. Project briefs she was never supposed to see, now handed to her with clipped instructions and unreasonable deadlines. Slack messages at odd hours. Passive-aggressive notes about her availability. It didn't take a genius to see what was happening. Nancy was being punished, for being visible, for being chosen, for stepping outside her invisible lane. She started going home later than ever, sometimes after everyone had gone. She worked quietly in the glow of her monitor, sipping cold tea and massaging her temples. There were nights she fell asleep with her laptop still open on her chest. One morning, she woke up with a tension headache, so severe she threw up before even brushing her teeth. Still, she showed up. Still, she performed. Because she didn't have the luxury of quitting. Not now, not yet. And because quietly, beneath the exhaustion and resentment, something had been lit inside her. A slow-burning resolve. She couldn't quite name it, but she knew it had to do with being seen. With finally hearing her voice bounce off someone else's ribcage and echo back in recognition. Someone like Elijah Cross. It was during the third committee meeting that something shifted. The team was discussing internal communication. How memos were lost, policies poorly explained, feedback loops broken. Someone suggested a new platform, another suggested digital signage. Nancy sat quietly at first, not wanting to overtake the conversation again. But when she finally did speak, Elijah turned his chair slightly toward her, signaling not just attention, but intention. "I think the real issue," she said slowly, "is that communication isn't broken. It's filtered. Management gets the version of reality they want, not the one that actually exists." Silence. She wasn't wrong. And everyone in that room knew it. Elijah nodded. "Can you give an example?" She hesitated. This was a dangerous tightrope. But she was too tired to walk carefully anymore. "Sure," she said. "Let's talk about task delegation. There are departments where junior staff are handling not just their own responsibilities, but those of their supervisors, without acknowledgement or credit. And if they complain, they're labeled difficult. If they don't, they burn out. Either way, the system wins." Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked at her, really looked, and then turned to the HR rep at the table. "Is there any tracking system in place for task assignment at the micro level?" The HR rep blinked. No, not really. Not unless someone formally escalates it." "And how often does that happen?" "Rarely. I mean, people don't want to seem difficult," Nancy finished, folding her hands in her lap. The meeting ended early. Elijah didn't say much after that. He closed his notebook, thanked everyone, and left. Nancy stayed behind to gather her things, her hands slightly trembling. Had she gone too far? Would there be consequences? Would her badge stop working tomorrow? She tried to dismiss the thought, but it clung to her like fog. That night, as she sat cross-legged on her couch with takeout she couldn't taste, her phone vibrated. It was an internal calendar invite. Subject, one-on-one check-in. From Elijah Cross. Location, executive floor, room 4B. Time, tomorrow, 9:15 a.m. She stared at it for a full minute before clicking accept.